Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this evening's In Conversation event with Amitai Romm and Andreas Ibrom. My name's Robert Leckie, I'm the director here at Spike Island, and we're really excited to host this conversation with Amitai and Andreas following Amitai's solo exhibition Hum that was presented here at Spike Island this summer. So before we get started, I'd just like to cover some practicalities. The event will last around an hour. We'll start with a 10-minute presentation by Andreas, and this will be followed by a conversation between the three of us that will last for around 30 minutes, focusing on Amitai's commission for Spike Island and how this relates to some of Andreas's research. To end, we'll open to questions from the audience, and if you'd like to contribute, please do share any comments on the YouTube chat. Also, just to remind everyone that all of Spike Island's public programs seek to create an environment for critical and open-minded discussion. So we politely ask that all comments are respectful of and generative for our guests and audiences. This event is made possible thanks to the West of England Visual Arts Alliance programme and is supported by Arts Council England. And before we start, I'd like to briefly introduce our guests. So Amitai Romm is an artist and researcher living in Copenhagen, often combining archaic, mundane, and high-tech materials and references. Romm makes installations and images as forms of science fiction. He's a co-founder of Diakron, a studio for transdisciplinary research and practice, as well as Primer, a platform for artistic and organizational development, which is in the headquarters of the global water technology company Aquaporin in Denmark. Romm's work has been presented internationally, recently at Kunstmuseum Bonn, Moderna Museet, and the Shanghai Biennial, as well as at Spike Island. Andreas is Associate Professor of Biometeorology at the Department of Environment and Resource Engineering at the Technical University of Denmark. His research focuses on land-atmosphere exchange and its implications for ecosystems and the climate. Teaching industrial ecology brought him to consider nature and culture as one ecosystem, and to better understand the drivers of severe global socio-ecological crisis. His main scientific achievements include the ongoing development of ecosystem observation and the development of international research networks, such as the Integrated Carbon Observation System, or ICOS, which he's going to talk about today. So thank you, Amitai and Andreas, for being here. We're really happy to have you both with us. And Andreas, please take it away with your presentation when you're ready.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and also a very nice feeling to contribute not only to science but also to art. But the audience might be interested what is the motivation for the experiment that we have, the observations that we have in the beech forest that delivers data that is then worked into the art exhibition. So connecting with ecosystems at Hum, Spike Island, Bristol. The motivation can be discussed in many ways, but the main motivation and why we get the money for doing this very intensive research is this. And I show you the famous Keeling curve because it tells us what science is able to do. This is a CO2 concentration that is measured at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, and it has increased by 1/3 since 1960. So that is my lifetime. And the color code is the temperature change, the global temperature change, where the increase of the average temperature has reached now 1 degree, and you all have heard about that the critical threshold is 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. So that is the situation. I will comment on this curve a little bit later, also regarding these fluctuations that you see that one would not expect usually. So if you want to tackle this problem, then you have to reduce the emissions. The concentration rise is a natural consequence of the emissions, and science has produced these scenarios that guides us to a climate that is below a threshold of dangerous climate change. So this is what we should follow. But if you look at the black points, this is what actually happened. And this material has been published in 2007. So now I believe we have 2022. So it's not really happening that much. And the question is why? Are we indifferent, or what is the problem? And one thing is, of course, that we need to corroborate these scenarios. So we need to know more about the Earth system. And the other is maybe also that we are unconnected to this abstract information. And here I see the connection to this exhibition. But if we look at the role of ecosystems for climate change and within this problem, then we can see that ecosystems respond to the increase of CO2 concentration by taking CO2 up. So they help to buffer the system. And that means that ecosystems reduce the temperature increase because they take up more carbon dioxide than they emit. So ecosystem can cool the climate. But if the climate change is exceeding critical thresholds, then impacts on the ecosystems can turn them from a net CO2 sink to a net CO2 source. And then ecosystems can warm this climate. And this should, of course, be known if you want to make accurate projections of the climate problem. And of course, beyond this, ecosystems provide us with services that we depend on. So ecosystems are very important for our living. So this gives us now the motivation to start with a global system, and here a European system that observes the carbon balance of the entire continent and the role of technical sources and biological things within that. And we can see here this ICOS, Integrated Carbon Observation System, that is a research infrastructure, like CERN, for example, the particle accelerator, but distributed. So that is the specific of this system. And the green dots are ecosystem stations, and the red dots are atmospheric stations. And there is also a network of ocean observations. Here is an overview about the Danish contribution to ICOS, and we have sites on Greenland and in mainland and Denmark, continental Denmark, and also Zealand. And the lower right picture is from the Sorø beach forest site that delivers the data to the exhibitions. How does an ecosystem observation site look like? There is a lot of technology, and we aim at observing the processes 24/7 and in a high temporal resolution. And what happens in an ecosystem? So if you look out, if you are out there, you can't really see what is happening. The main effect that you can measure is the gas exchange. That is the exchange of carbon dioxide and water with the atmosphere. And this is something that we can measure with this instrument here. Cursor is not working. Okay, doesn't matter. So we have equipment above the forest that is measuring these fluxes, and we get diurnal courses, meaning we see from half hour to half hour how the CO2 is transported between the atmosphere and the forest. And of course, there are a load of manual measurements that we do, and other meteorological measurements that form a data set on the reaction of the ecosystems and the potential drivers that is mainly the atmosphere and also the management. So we can use this concentration time series in order to calculate stocks, because the CO2 stocks in the atmosphere is like a big bucket. So if the concentration changes, then this is due to fluxes. And on the green line is now the net cumulated uptake of carbon dioxide by this forest. So we can see that the forest has, in the 25 years that we are investigated, has taken up to 60 tons of carbon per hectare. Per hectare. And here you can also see the interesting overlap with the oscillation in the CO2 stock, and that is due to the effects of forests. So forests take up carbon in the northern summer, because we have more forests in the northern summer. So you can see the signature of the CO2 uptake in the Sorel beech forest, directly also in the global concentration anomaly. And that tells us very nicely how important the biosphere is in order to affect the global carbon cycle. So the most important result is not only the flux, but also understanding how ecosystems do this and how they work. And this is the next slide, where you get a nice impression of a beech forest. And I would like to draw your attention to the different timescales where things happen. So the CO2 transport happens immediately in very fast fluctuating way. The radiation and the meteorological drivers are a little bit longer scales. Then the ecosystem starts to buffer this information in the water storage, the carbon uptake. So these are, please remember, mind this logarithmic scale. So the scales get very quickly from seconds to 10 years to 100 years and to millions of years. So finally, this ecosystem is also a product of evolution like we are. And I think the time scales that happen at the same time and act in the response of an ecosystem, that is something that gives the link to the exhibition now, because there it's also about rhythms and information as time series from such an ecosystem.
Thank you, Andreas. Andreas, are you able to turn the sound off?
Pardon?
Yeah, I just wanted to check that you can turn the sound off on the presentation. It stopped.
Yeah.
It was still.
Yes, I can do that.
It was still going for me. Thank you so much for that whistle-stop tour of work that you've been doing for so long. It's really fascinating. One thing that really struck me when you were speaking was this idea of like time and scale that you were talking about at the end, and it made me wonder about how things have shifted since these stations were set up, because presumably there have been considerable advancements in technology since they were established. And with the timescales that you're talking about, the kind of data sets that you want to track must also presumably change, or were they established kind of very early on and they just continue? How do you kind of introduce change and kind of new aspects of study into a system which is so kind of historic and established?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and it's really going into the heart of such a network. We have to make sure that we follow the same standards, or if we introduce something new technology, then we have to make sure that the legacy data are compatible with the new data. And this is something very technical, but very much needed in order to fulfill our mission. So to measure change, that shouldn't be an artifact from our changing measurement devices. And what we are doing is, so since ICOS, we have a complete new set of sensors, but we leave the old sensors running to have a long enough overlap to show the legacy data are still in the range of the new data or so. And I might also just remind you this Mauna Loa observation that is started even earlier, and they have kept the same high standards from that time on. So that makes it really valuable. It is a masterpiece of science, I would say.
Mm. And Amitai, from your perspective, why were you so interested in this kind of sensing station in particular? And how did you and Andreas meet? How did you get to know each other, and kind of what drew you to this work that Andreas is doing?
Yeah, I think in terms of like an exhibition or an art experience, I was thinking, or I was like wondering about what kind of like imaginative abilities this kind of perception requires of us or asks us to have. I think it's quite like this like time scale makes a lot of sense in that thing, like the logarithmic time scale from seconds, or in the actual measurements it's even like tens of seconds, right, until like billions of years. It's like it's a kind of perception that's only possible through like a very like sophisticated technical apparatus. It's highly mediated. What kind of imaginative kind of abilities does it kind of like ask us to have? And there's an interplay between the rhythms that the ecosystem has and the kind of rhythms that the technical apparatus has, which are meaningful in relation to the ecosystem, but also meaningful because of the science and the kind of rigor that Andreas was talking about. So I was thinking a lot about that. The initial kind of way that we met Andreas was through a different or like related project that I did with Diakron, Aslak Helm and Bjarke Kure and Emil Rønn Andersen, where we were kind of in the end worked on ended up being a sort of like a film project. Not really, but I worked for the Shanghai Biennial in 21, where we were looking at kind of like the full scale or like the full stack, what we thought of as the full stack of climate science, where I believe that like a station like ECOS is kind of the sensing layer, or the layer that really like produces the stuff that is like underlying the larger kind of like simulations, so like climate simulations. Yeah. And I just thought it was like fascinating research. It's also like a very beautiful site and a beautiful kind of like, in a way, like a humble practice that goes on at that site, which I think has a lot of kind of like potential. It's not really something that is in the exhibition per se, but yeah, I'd actually like more people to experience like a place like the like the measuring station that you have, Andreas, because I think it's a very beautiful kind of de facto entanglement between technology, human practice, and forest. Yeah.
And Amitai, in terms of thinking through this entanglement and trying to set up kind of new entanglements, if you will, with the exhibition that you presented at Spike Island, do you want to talk through like actually how you came to thinking of sound, or in fact kind of the absence of sound, as being an interesting carrier for some of this information, and just maybe talk through how you set up this kind of dynamic between the research station in Denmark and the show here in Bristol.
Sure. Yeah. I guess one thing that seemed like really fun to set up was that like Sorø and Bristol are like two completely like unrelated, or like in this sense they were kind of like two random spatial geographies that maybe don't have anything to do with each other. But as something that you were also talking about, Andreas, is that the stuff that happens, or the stuff that you're measuring at the station, is like it's that forest and that place, but really it shows things that are happening everywhere. So so there's already kind of relationship between Bristol and Sorø because climate change is like happening everywhere, right? Yeah, I was thinking like how to create a connection, or basically how to think about the exhibition space as a medium, and what kind of affordances that space might have in creating a connection. So basically what we did was to take like the rhythms of the various measurement apparatuses, which is really like maybe not exactly what Andreas is talking about, but all the stuff that informs those larger kind of models, which is, I think the fastest kind of rhythm is like 10 times per second, and turn that into sound waves basically. So I liked the idea of the infrasound because it is something that acts from within. And I think to create like some of the connections that might be necessary to think about a perception that we might need is like to transgress this dichotomy between the human and the non-human is also going from like comfortable distinctions to like weird situations where yeah, like things get weird. So I like this thing that the rhythm that it would make would be closer to one's heartbeat, or something that comes from within, or something that moves the space, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it does. And so yeah, so as an audience in the situation of the exhibition, you were then encountering these huge speakers that would project this kind of like infrasound at you, these very, very low frequency subwoofers. And so it was also something that then, yeah, very physically it was felt rather than heard as an experience. And in a way, therefore, it kind of materializes and kind of embodies this experience that feels so distant, but then, as you also say, Amitai, is actually very present in terms of, you know, the effect that we're having on the planet and the way in which the planet is changing, and the extremely negative effects of that we're all very aware of, but feel also deeply abstract. And I wonder, Andreas, how this must kind of impact your own work and research, because obviously you know you're contributing, as you've laid out in your presentation, to these really, you know, this amazing body of research that somehow represents these seismic changes in the way in which the planet works or indeed doesn't work. And I guess in terms of the kind of day-to-day work of being at the research station, setting things up, it actually, by the sounds of it, having not been there myself, sounds kind of idyllic and quite kind of like remote and quite romantic, but then it's also speaking to these incredibly difficult and depressing issues of planetary change. And so I wonder, in your own experience as a researcher and someone who spent a lot of time with this site and the kind of research that it produces, how you kind of deal with that difference in kind of time and scale with your own kind of labor day to day.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's interesting that you include this, have this perspective of romantic perception here in this. Of course, you work with objects that you like and you're interested in. It's driven by curiosity, but it's also overwhelming, the insight that you get. So because you cannot have this insight just by being there. So we create this data, and they show things like, for example, the 2018 heat wave. What was exceptional with this heat wave? How did the ecosystem respond to a shortage of water and at high temperatures? And we could only show this because we had the long time series. So keeping these instruments running is quite a tedious work. And you ask yourself, does it make sense? What is a new year of data more worth? Is it worth the effort? And then you get suddenly these events and see, okay, if we hadn't done this, we wouldn't know. So I sometimes say to my colleagues, what is not measured is lost. So we have the chance to follow what's happening in this changing world because we are doing this. So that makes me a little bit proud. That is, of course, human. But it is in fact a motor of this. So now we have this long time series, and we can show things that we would never be able to show if we hadn't done this. And the other aspect that you mentioned is trying to get into the ecosystem and understand what's going on there. What is explaining how it's responding? That goes directly into the knowledge and the scientific status, which is incorporated in models. So the models that we increasingly depend on are being tested by empirical evidence that we create. And that is very important, because we rely on them regarding the projections in the future.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And I was thinking when you were talking about one of the other works, which is in the show, which also tries to take some of the kind of material remains or debris from the forest and incorporate it in the work, right? And so it's another way of trying to, I guess, yeah, bring the forest to the gallery, bring the forest to Bristol in some way. And in this work, Amitai, you kind of made this, you made a material that combined the debris from the forest floor with the shredded confidential documents from Spike Island. And you used that to cover these parabola shapes that you had 3D printed, which also created some really interesting effects when you got close to them, when you were listening to the sound or the kind of non-sound pieces, it was reverberating through the space. So I wonder, also thinking about this kind of this switch in scale and how actually you try to think not only in terms of like taking the data that is being produced by the station and the different kind of timescales, the different registers that are in operation there, but also bringing the kind of material remnants of the forest to Spike Island, but giving it a different form also. It's kind of in a way a similar move to changing the data that you get from the sensing station and creating sound or non-sound from it. Why did you choose to kind of combine, yeah, these different materials to make these sculptural forms?
Yeah, I guess in the beginning, I guess so the parabolic shape is like is something that I have been working with for some time, and it's kind of continuously like dragged on into different projects, because initially it was this like it's an object that's made to receive information like a commercial satellite dish receiver. But when you put it in an exhibition context, it becomes something that supposedly like emits or has meaning, or is meant to speak in a certain way. So I liked I was thinking about paper, I guess, and writing, legibility, and these kind of things to make a kind of a paper from the forest. That was kind of the initial start for it, I guess. And then there came something that is maybe from doing this combination of things I've been I've been thinking a little bit about how the debris or the things, the leaves that the forest shed is then in turn something that becomes part of the productive like humus layer for new kind of for new life to happen. And yeah, just this juxtaposition between the stuff that fell from the trees and the stuff that is like discarded or shredded by the institution. How might that be like what kind of use does that have, you know? That's something that I came to think of, I guess, afterwards, and maybe would be interesting to work a little bit more with that later on. But yeah, as you say, they also basically modulate the sound waves, because just the physical form of the parabolic shape is something that concentrates sound waves and microwaves and other light waves, basically, also, right? Yeah, but I guess it was just to have like kind of do like the direct kind of like link of like, which is like a digital technical link, and then work with the more kind of like forest brew witchy kind of like boiling, going to Sorø, getting the leaves and boiling them and making paper out of it. Yeah.
But there's also something that's kind of a move that you've made in previous works too, right? So this kind of connection between, I guess, technology of some form and natural materials. So it's something that's kind of like threaded through a variety of different projects that you've engaged with.
Yeah, definitely. I'm definitely like drawn to these like intertwining of this like biological and technological and the cultural. And I guess that's also why climate research is kind of interesting, because climate is one of the places where these things are really entangled in a wicked way. Yeah.
No, sure. And then in terms of, I guess, in terms of this idea of ecosystem, the thing that's really fascinating to me, Andreas, in terms of your presentation, is thinking about the amount of things that you're measuring all at once and trying to understand how they interrelate and what they communicate together. And there's something I think that for me is really interesting in relation to what I think Amitai is trying to do with the show around kind of communication, which is in a way establish a link which feels kind of direct and, you know, it's undergirded by technology, but then actually the way in which the work communicates is not direct. There isn't a kind of a clear agenda or message that it's communicating more of a feeling. And maybe this is a little bit a little bit out there, but I think there's something about like, what are the feelings that like the forest is trying to communicate, and are the tools for measuring that we have in the research station able to kind of register or acknowledge what it's trying to communicate, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, well, this is not the interrelationships. This is something that we as humans see, but whether they exist or not is it may be artificial. So we like to see interrelationships, and that is the whole concept of ecosystems. We could say it's just a piece of nature that does this at this moment, but we as scientists say, okay, there are relationships. So litter is being produced, nutrients are trapped in this litter. The microflora is now digesting it and releasing these nutrients. So it's different from your confidential material. It is still hidden, but here the nutrients are being released and being taken up again. Much of those processes we can only speculate on. So there is nobody who can really measure the transport of a nitrate molecule from a litter to the root. But by investigating the stocks and their changes, and then forming this theoretical construct of the relationships between them, make us understand how the ecosystem is working. That is all hypothetically, but models which are fed with the theory are able to predict ecosystem behavior as we measure it. And that gives us somehow a confidence into that the knowledge that we have generated is about facts here and not only scientific speculation. So that's why we need these many different measurements in the ecosystem, because the relationships that we assume are very complex. And the more data we have, the more we are able to falsify, for example, useless hypotheses and corroborate our knowledge. So that's why it's particularly important to do a large diversity and a high number of measurements, although it will never be enough for a complete description. That is a difference between life and physics. Physical objects, at least in the macrocosmos, we can really speak of cause-effect relationships. In things like complex like ecosystems or human beings, we need a little bit of different approach here.
Yeah, sure. And this idea of limitation also seems present in the work somehow, Amitai. It's like it's not trying to like genuinely give like a full picture. It's actually like it's interested in limitation. It's interested in obscurity, and also by nature of the fact that these sound waves are projected from these very low frequency units and they enter our bodies, they also kind of mingle with like the natural rhythms of our own bodies, right? Our heartbeats and whatever. And so it feels like this sense of limitation and kind of I don't know, what's beyond understanding is also like a fascination to you in the work too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's something like some other like in the earlier work have also kind of used the strategy of kind of in a way mistaking the exhibition format for like a literal device or a literal machine. So thinking about the diffusion of aesthetics as like, what if it was actually like a machine for diffusing these things? And I think it's a little bit similar strategy that goes on in this show to basically make the room itself into a device or speaker where the room itself is like resonating with the sounds. But sometimes it's things that it is like a little bit difficult to speak of it, and it's also why this is like I think these explorations happen through like exhibitions as the medium, because it's something to explore and experiment with, to see like if a connection is made or not. So in that sense, it's like a difficult exhibition to mediate, because one of the main parts of the work is only really something you can experience on site, right? But yeah, I think this thing of like, I guess let's say that the station has a role in kind of like mediating the forest itself, and the exhibition looks at a kind of the assemblage between it's like a misconception or misinterpretation, but it's the assemblage between the forest and the technical apparatus is the object that I'm trying to like look at and think about what is an experience of that thing, which is a highly mediated and also quite alienating construct in many ways. Because really the things that are sensed through the apparatus is it's kind of like, yeah, it's like non-human or technical or even frightening or inhuman. Like just the staggering amount of things that go on all the time, and the time scales and the kind of like even just the forms of the feedback loops, those kind of things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like its immensity. It's like makes it impossible to process or like comprehend or something. But there's something, or no, or not.
It's not impossible, but it's definitely possible through the station to some degree, but there's also like a surplus, which is maybe not integratable. Yeah.
I was thinking about this idea that ICOS is a research infrastructure, and I actually think that in the way that you're talking about the exhibition, it's almost like for you, like the exhibition is also like a research infrastructure. Like you set up a situation, let's say, or a system that then people can come engage with and take different aspects from that are kind of relevant to their experience or relevant to their interests. So obviously some people, experience this work very viscerally and actually found it quite difficult to be in the room with, whereas other people would come and were completely enamored with it and would want to spend a huge amount of time there. And so there's this kind of like sense in which, the exhibition form kind of mirrors this work that somehow ICOS is doing, like out in the forest, in that it's like kind of a space of potential, I guess, where like different research inquiries can be applied or different experiences can be applied. I think that's like a nice analogy that I'd not thought about before this conversation. But yeah. Okay, I think we're kind of nearly at time, so I'm gonna jump into some questions that we have from the audience. So I don't know who these are directed at, but I think probably at both of you. So the first one is from Maggie, and Maggie says that often it's said to exist a huge gap between aloof and unemotional natural scientists and engaged and emotional artists. Is your impression that Hum has somehow bridged this gap? So I wonder what you both think about that.
I don't know about this exhibition specifically, but I have experiences from other processes where I don't really recognize that distinction. First of all, don't really recognize maybe that distinction in practice with the people that I've met, but also that I guess like things that are more like boundary objects, kind of like aesthetic objects are maybe I don't know if it's like useful is kind of the wrong word, but they have a relevance also in like a scientific context, because they refract some questions in like very different ways than the research does. If that makes sense. What do you think, Andreas?
Well, it's an interesting question, first of all, and it reflects a little bit our human condition, because we perceive something from outside and a lot of things happen inside. And the one science branch is looking at the outside and the objective world that is the same for everyone, and the other is the subjective world. And you are bridging this, I would say, like poems bridge this too. They create feelings that you can't describe with a lot of words. You just have to listen to them, and then something has to happen. And that is for me also really an interesting aspect here, that you took this data, which is kind of dry numbers, digital, we are really, and transport this into an experience that must resolve something, and you don't know what depends on the subject that is experiencing it. And it would be extremely interesting for me to get some of the insights that can be harvested from that. Another way of looking at the same thing, like our data, and maybe we get some new ideas to interpret those, looking from different perspectives or so. So yes, from both sides could be a bridge.
Yeah. So yeah, I think a related question to this is from Nella, which is more about kind of how it felt working together when scientific processes and discourses are so focused on precision, whereas art is always about the speculative and imaginative.
There's also like the missing link in the conversation is, of course, there's like, I guess often there's like a question of like different dialects or different languages, and translators are needed, so people who are really like proficient in both ways of speaking. And the person that I collaborated with on creating the infrasound piece is Tiger or Anthony, who really sits in that intersection of like being an actual kind of like translator. No, I forgot the question. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it was about this idea of like how to mediate between the kind of precision of science and the kind of speculative and imaginative potential of art, I guess. And I guess you're saying, yeah, that Anthony was really key to actually making that kind of connection work and to kind of make it legible, which is interesting. The idea of a kind of like technological translator, I guess.
Yeah, really also just about experience in different fields. Yeah, and so one thing that we've been trying to do in Diakron is also to really just like focus on processes and instead of like outcomes. So building good processes that can make meaningful relationships between people who are like come from very different fields. I think is really the most important aspect. And thinking like, thinking about process and thinking long term instead of thinking about outcomes. It's kind of basic, but yeah.
No, I think it's interesting. And then there's one final question, which is really about how you decided to take particular types of data from the forest and to mediate them as sound waves, right? So what are the creative processes that kind of drove that decision? And I guess fundamentally, like why did sound or infrasound seem like the best vehicle for this process of translation?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess one thing is that the infrasound is itself like a bar, sits on a kind of a weird place where it is sound, but it's actually, maybe it's more like air pressure because it's not audible, but it's felt. I wanted something that was like a liminal kind of medium for the information. And the idea also then came from looking at the data set and the measurements and how the rhythms of the measurement apparatuses, like that the fastest measurement at the station was 10 hertz, which was exactly just around that was what these like quite sophisticated speakers could reproduce. But to turn this rhythm into a sound wave and have that sound wave be modulated by real-time data was I was just like really curious to see what kind of experience that would make. So we worked with as much data as we could really get our hands on from the station.
Great, thank you very much. I think that we're out of time, so I think we should wrap up, but I just want to end by saying thank you so much to both of you for your contributions, and it's really great to be able to think with you, Andreas, about the amazing work that you're doing, and to kind of get a very quick whistle-stop tour of its immense complexity is really, really fascinating, and thinking about, you know, its relevance to Amitai and the work and the show that we presented here at Spike Island. So thank you so much for your time and for your generosity this evening, and thanks everyone for also attending the event and for asking such great questions. So yeah, I think we can leave it there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you, and I'm looking forward to hear more responses, maybe from the audience, responding to this piece of art. It would be nice that could be communicated back to us, and we will for sure also highlight this event as an output of ICOS. So motivate people to use it, and for all kinds of stuff, not only for science, is very good. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andreas.
Thank you.